This video is looking at the area of squares, rectangles, and triangles. Now, several things we need to remember when we're working with area. Area is the amount of space inside the shape. All dimensions must be in the same unit before we start, and it's got to be measured in squared units. So, for example, squared millimeters, squared centimeters, squared meters, or even squared kilometers. The way we write that is the abbreviation. So for example, for centimeters, we use cm, and then you use a little squared symbol. Now, the key thing to remember when it comes to area is that you're multiplying adjacent sides. So if I've got a square, and this is the length, and this is the breadth, I'm trying to work out the area inside that shape, and you can see I've drawn myself a big multiplication sign because what I'm going to do to work out my area is area equals length times breadth, and I'm going to abbreviate it to L times B. So we're going to find the area of this square. So area A equals length times breadth. Now, if I look at my shape, I've got a breadth, that's 5 meters, but I also know that the properties of a square mean that all the sides are the same. So that means I can fill in 5 meters on the length at the bottom of the square. I also need to check that my units are the same, and they are. So they're both in meters, so now I can substitute it into my formula, and that means that I'm doing 5 multiplied by 5. That gives me an area of 25, and my units are squared meters. So the next example, I want to find the area of a rectangle. And you can see here, my rectangle is 10 centimeters by 35 millimeters. And that's something that you need to pay attention to, because remember we said at the start, our units have got to be the same for working out the area. So we can either convert the centimeters into millimeters and work out our area in squared millimeters, or we can work out our millimeters into centimeters and work out our area in squared centimeters. So I'm going to convert my 35 millimeters into centimeters. So I know that there are 10 millimeters in a centimeter. So I need to do 35 divided by 10 in order to get the number of centimeters. Now remember, when you're dividing, you're jumping your decimal point one back for the number of zeros that you've got on your number. So we are going to jump that decimal point in between the 3 and the 5. So 35 millimeters is the same as 3.5 centimeters. So now my adjacent sides are labelled, and I've got everything in the same unit. So I'm going to write my formula. So A equals length times breadth. My length is 10 and my breadth is 3.5. And if I multiply them together, then I'm going to end up with 35 centimeters squared, or squared centimeters. Now, what about the formula for the area of a triangle? Now, if you remember from a previous video, if we were to draw in a full rectangle, you can see I have two identical triangles. So if I work out the length times the breadth of my rectangle and divide by 2, then I'm left with one triangle. Now in triangles, instead of referring to the dimensions as length and breadth, we refer to it as base and height. And so basically the formula is area equals a half times the base times the height. You're multiplying the base times the height, and you're dividing by 2. The height must be the vertical or perpendicular, so the one that's at right angles to the base. It cannot be the longest side, because that is not the height that we are using for our triangle. So the first triangle we're going to look at, we're going to calculate the area of this triangle, which has a base of 6 centimeters and a height of 4.5 centimeters. So we can either work it out remembering that we're going to do base times height, and then we're going to divide that by 2. So 6 times 4.5 gives me 27 divided by 2, and 27 divided by 2 gives me 13.5 centimeters squared. Now, if you want to use the formula, let's do it in a different color down here. You're using A equals a half times the base times the height. And that's a half, or if you're using a calculator, remember that's 0.5, multiplied by the base, which is 6, and multiplied by the height, which is 4.5. And that gives us 13.5 centimeters squared. And the final example, we're going to calculate the area of this triangle. And it has a base of 2.5 meters and a height of 10 meters. It's an isosceles triangle, and just because the height's marked on the outside of the triangle, it's still the height that's going from the top vertex down to the base at right angles. So let's use our formula. Area equals a half times the base times the height. So it's a half multiplied by the base, which is 2.5, multiplied by the height, which is 10. And that gives us 12.5. This time my units are meters, so my units for my area are going to be squared meters.